Hello, everybody. Bruce from Oregon here with the Bruce from Oregon Show. This is episode 0. It might be the first, it might be the last. We're going to find out. Now, today we're doing another installment in my Management Best Known Practices series and playlist. Check out all my playlists. I've got live stream playlists, video game playthrough playlists, management playlists, all kinds of things. Okay. And of course, joined today with us here is a bunch of moose, because the plural of moose is moose. We could have one moose or we could have 3 moose, and we just don't even know. Some people think these moose look delicious. As a human-shaped moose, I cannot say one way or the other whether the moose is delicious, but that's where we are. So today our topic is policies versus guidelines. Okay. We're going to talk about the difference between these, what they mean, how to recognize the differences, and how to communicate the differences to your employees properly. So that's our topic. So let's start with the basic definitions of policy versus guideline if we look them up with a Google search. Now, Google's AI overview says that the main difference between a policy and a guideline is that a policy is mandatory, while a guideline is not. And I agree with this. Now, what they say here next is that a policy is a set of rules that employees must follow to achieve a specific goal. Policies are mandatory and often required by law or company values. Employees who violate a policy may be disciplined or fired. In contrast, a guideline. What is a guideline then? A guideline is a general recommendation that provides advice on how to perform a task or proceed in a situation. Guidelines are not mandatory, and employees who don't follow them usually won't face discipline. Guidelines are designed to be open to interpretation and provide flexibility for unseen circumstances. So, for example, an employer might have a policy that says, hey, in our parking lot, you cannot bring firearms, loaded or unloaded firearms, onto our parking lot. It's private property. That is our policy. Now, how do we differentiate this from a guideline where they say, well, we'd prefer people don't bring loaded or unloaded firearms into the parking lot of the facility? So the way a policy has to work is you need to look for 2 things, okay? You need to look for some sort of measurement system or observational system that can detect when a policy is being followed and when a policy is not being followed. So, for example, the parking lot may have security cameras. It may have security guards that patrol the parking lot. And if someone is found violating a policy in the parking lot, then the security cameras and or the security guards or, another employee may be able to detect the policy violation. Let's do another example. If we have expense reports at a company, you go on a business trip and you want to be reimbursed for your hotel and rental car. The company may have an expense report policy that says you have to fill out the expense report policy within a certain amount of time. You have to fill out certain fields in an exact way to indicate, you have to attach receipts. Maybe that's the policy. How do you know if someone followed the policy or not? There may be automated tools that look at a expense report and flag any exceptions to the policy or fields that haven't been filled out properly, missing receipts that haven't been attached. In addition, there may be somebody that works in the finance department that literally looks at your expense report. Also, your manager may look at your expense report before it's submitted. And so there are ways to check or observe if the policy is happening or not. The second thing that a policy has to have, if it's a real policy, is some sort of repercussion or action if the policy is not followed properly. So let's go back to our 2 examples. If somebody inadvertently brings a bunch of, firearms onto the parking lot of the employer's property, and they're observed doing this, maybe they're moving them around in their truck, they're getting ready to go duck hunting or something, and a security guard drives by and sees them doing this, or, you know, a security guard notices that they're doing this on a security camera, there could be repercussions. They may receive a written warning. They may be detained by the security guard to see, hey, what are you doing? If they are up to no good, they may be charged with criminal charges. The person may lose their job. They may be fired for not following the policy. So there's real repercussions with a policy. Okay. In the expense report example, we talked about how a manager or someone in finance or an automated system may check your expense report for the policy. If you don't follow the policy, the expense report may be rejected and returned to the employee, which means that the effect or the repercussion of not following the policy is that you won't get paid yet. You won't get reimbursed. So if you want to have your hotel and rental car reimbursed, you got to fill out the expense report properly. So that is the second thing to look for to understand if something is really a policy or not. And with a guideline where they say it's a general recommendation, like maybe your company recommends, I don't know, what's a good recommendation? Maybe they recommend that you watch a training video, but the training video is optional. Okay, it's not mandatory. And it's just an option that you have, but they have a guideline that says, when you have a new employee, we recommend that they watch 3 mandatory videos and they could watch 3 optional videos. So there's a guideline to watch these extra videos. That could be a guideline. There could be guidelines like, hey, we have the company printer, and the guideline is you shouldn't print, more than 100 pages a month or 1,000 pages a month or something on the printer because it's too much. But it's not a policy. Maybe you have a job where you have to exceed their guidelines sometimes because there's a big trade show coming up or something like that. A guideline is more loose. Like a guideline is just like, yeah, we want employees to take a lunch break at noon to 1. But if you like eating lunch early or you have a big lunchtime meeting, take your lunch from 11 to noon or from 1 to 2 or, a noon to 1 lunch hour might just be a guideline. And then if the employee, for example, is salaried, they can make up their own mind as to when to eat lunch. This would be a guideline. There's no repercussion if the employee doesn't follow the guideline. Okay? It's just advice. So, as a manager, your job is really to explain to your employees what is really a policy and what is really a guideline and not conflate the two. In some of my jobs in the past, I have seen, corporate people in management or HR or wherever conflate a policy with a guideline or use the terminology interchangeably. And this is a big mistake because if you really do have a policy that you are going to measure and enforce if someone doesn't follow it, employees need to know that as early as possible or before they make a mistake. If you are loose with your terminology and you conflate policies and guidelines, an employee might confuse a mandatory policy with an optional guideline and then violate a policy and then have to face repercussions that they might not have thought they needed to face because they thought it was just a guideline. Like the guy who was moving his duck hunting guns around in the parking lot. You have to know what the policies are so that you can avoid violating them or that you can comply with them if they need you to do something specifically like training classes so that you don't violate the policy. So this is my advice to managers. Know what is a policy and how to identify it with the 2 attributes, the measurement and the repercussions, and know what's a guideline or just general advice. Now, when I was looking around for material on this, I noticed the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is where I went to college, so I have a fondness for it, has a nice article here on their website, development.policy.wisc.edu. I used to have a wisc.edu email address back in like 1993. Wild times. Back in the day, until I graduated. Let's see. So their article says, is it a policy, procedure, or guideline? Now, the interesting thing here that I think is sort of more of a advanced topic, Policies 102, is they add in the concept of a procedure. So we've already talked about a policy. We've already talked about a guideline. Let's see if our definitions that we talked about earlier with our examples comply with this article from the University of Wisconsin. Now, they say a policy is a general written document that establishes a standard by which the institution manages its affairs. A policy mandates. So there's that word again, mandates. Mandatory. You have to do it. Specifies or prohibits. Prohibits. Otherwise, you have to do it or you have to not do it, depending on what it is. Mandates or prohibits conduct in order to enhance the institution's mission. That's fine. Potentially compliance with laws, regulations, promote operational efficiency, reduce institutional risk. Okay, so that's good. So it seems like their definition of a policy is in line with what we talked about before. Now let's do the procedure last, because that's the new one. Now for guidelines, they say a guideline gives recommendations. That's what we said before. Interpretations, administrative instructions, best practice guidance. Okay. Because the best practice today may not be the best practice tomorrow. Best practices can evolve over time. You may say, well, the last project that another team worked on at my company did X, Y, and Z. So to start my new project in my division, I'm going to take their best practices and copy them and do X, Y, and Z. And you may learn that for your market segment, for your product definition, it's actually best not to do X, Y, and Z. Maybe you have to do X, Y, and Q. And so you change the best practice definition for your context over time. These things can evolve, or frameworks. Okay. Guidelines are informational, not mandatory. Okay. So employees need to know what is mandatory and what is not. That's the key here, guys. Don't be confusing. Words matter, and these words matter, so we're going to try and get them right. Like procedures, guidelines may change frequently depending on the organization's needs. Well, I just talked about how best practices can change depending on the time, new technology, new products, new market segments, whatever it is you're doing with your job. So I think they agree with me there. So that's good. And then they say to see fictitious examples and read more about the criteria, see this document. I have this document open already. We'll look at it next. But first, I want to see what they define as a procedure, because I was primarily talking about policy versus guideline. That's the basics. That's the minimum you have to get right. Let's see what they define as a procedure. A procedure is a description of the operational processes necessary to implement policy. I see. A procedure includes information on the offices and positions responsible for policy implementation. Okay. So if you had instructions on how to file an expense report, that would be part of the expense report policy procedure. If, for example, there was a flow where you file an expense report as an employee and it goes to your manager, or you're the manager and you're receiving your employees' expense reports. And then once you look at that and think it's okay, maybe somebody in finance looks at it next, step 2 or step 3. Maybe step 1 is writing the expense report. Step 2 is the manager looking at it. And step 3 is somebody in finance looking at it. This flow is basically a procedure. So I think what they're saying here is that the fundamentals of the policy are going to be what is required or what is prohibited. And then the procedure is the documentation around how are you going to measure and potentially what are going to be the repercussions if the policy is not followed. Let's see if they talk about that. A properly developed and approved procedure ensures that policy is implemented efficiently and applied consistently. Yeah, you don't want any double standards. So you don't want to, let's say you have some employees in California and some employees in Oregon, and there's no law mandating that you have to have a policy that's different between the two states. Sometimes state law requires different handling of employees in different states. Maybe vacation time has to be tracked differently or something like that. But if you just have a policy like, hey, we have an expense report policy, you don't want a different expense report policy in Oregon versus California because that's just going to be confusing. And it's a double standard. You don't want to appear to be more strict to one set of employees than another, unless it's required by individual state law or something like that. Okay, let's see. Unlike policy, procedures may change frequently to accommodate updated standards or methods. Yeah, that's correct. So if you have an expense report policy that says you have to fill out an expense report in a very specific way, and the repercussion, if you don't do it, is that you won't get reimbursed. The procedure may change over time. For example, when we had the 2020, everybody had to work from home because of the pandemics that were going on. We had specific expense report procedures for equipment that we might want to get reimbursed for working from home because we were working from home way more in 2020 than in 2019. The policy didn't change. You still have to fill out expense reports or you can't get a reimbursement. The procedure changed because these special pandemic reimbursements required that fields be filled out with very specific syntax. And if you didn't use the specific syntax in the specific fields, you weren't going to be reimbursed. So there's an example of a procedure changing over time for a given type of policy. Okay, so let's look at the examples that they have really quickly here. Now, can I make this? Oh boy, can I get rid of this thing? I don't know how to get rid of this thing, guys. We're just going to muddle through here. Let's look at this table, okay? Because they have some interesting examples. Policy column. Okay, we've already talked about what a policy is. States an institutional position, mandates, specifies, or prohibits. Has widespread application, is non-negotiable. Mandatory. Changes infrequently. Tells what should be done and sometimes why. Okay, that's good. Then they have the procedure, outlines standard practices for applying policy in specific situations. So a procedure document or set of instructions, these will be very good for an employee or a manager. Provides instructions, may have narrower focus scope than the policy. Yeah. So there may be different types of procedures for a given policy, depending upon how detailed we get. May be customizable and adaptable by unit. Sure. Because of state law, there may be different procedures that managers have to follow for certain policies, depending upon what state you're in, because of state law. So there could be unique circumstances there. Tells how something should be done, who should do it, when it should be done, and what steps should be taken. Yeah, who, what, when, why, how, where, all that, third grade, fourth grade newspaper writing best practices type of stuff. Yeah, that's what should go in your procedure or your instructions, high quality instructions. And then a guideline gives a general recommendation, provides helpful information about how to operate, provides advice on how to achieve a policy's objective in various situations, and is not mandatory. So if your group is writing software, you may have a guideline that says, hey, we want everybody to use Microsoft Visual Studio Code as a guideline. But if somebody in your team is a VI or Emacs, Eclipse, whatever, a different IDE power user, a different tool, that may be fine too. So in that case, what you have is really a guideline. You know, our recommendation is that people use Microsoft Visual Studio Code. But if you are a power user and you want to use a different integrated development environment, go right ahead. That's a guideline. Okay. And then they have a second page here with a bunch of fictitious examples, but I feel like I've already gone through examples that I feel like are applicable from, my experience and that I wanted to give. Um, so I'm not going to go through their examples. If you do a search for policy versus guideline in Wisconsin, you can find this document very quickly. It's just at development.policy.wisstudy.edu. Thanks to these guys for writing this up. And, having an attention to detail like myself. Thanks, guys. Um, Another thing I would say to managers in the next few years that's very important is this whole aspect of working from the office versus working from home. I mean, I mentioned this before. In 2020, we all had to work from home because of the pandemic details. And people learn that they can be really effective working at home. And a lot of companies are saying, well, now that people can work in the office, we want to mandate that people come to the office a certain number of days a week or on specific days a week. I think what employees really need their management hierarchy to do and the HR organizations to do is be very, very clear about what is a policy and what is a guideline when it comes to working in the office or working from the office or working from home. If you say, well, it's our policy that people come to the office 3 days a week, but you don't measure it, and there's no repercussions for employees who show up 1 day a week, then you don't really have a policy. You have a guideline. You need to tell your employees whether you have a policy or whether you have a guideline and what it is. And you have to tell your employees if you have a policy around working from the office. Number one, how are you going to measure it? Are employees required to badge in and badge out through turnstiles so you know when they're in the building and when they're not? And what are the repercussions for not following the policy? If somebody comes to the office 1 day a week instead of 3 days a week, are they going to be fired? Are they going to be ineligible for promotions? What are your repercussions? You need to be upfront and straightforward with employees. And as a manager, oftentimes you are not the one, if you're working in a big company, making these policies or guidelines directly. You may have some guidelines for your employees that you give them your recommendations based on your experience as a manager. Hey, coming into the office sometimes is nice. Okay, that's good management advice. 1 or 2 days a week. Okay, that's management advice. You need to express to HR, staffing, upper level management, executives, that they need to be very clear about the corporate policy versus guidelines in this case, because this is an area where I see a lot of confusion and a lot of differentiation between employers that's going to be able to happen over the next few years. And I think personally that employers who offer the greatest amount of flexibility when it comes to working from an office versus working from home for job roles that are amenable to remote work, they should embrace the remote work as much as they can. That's my advice. Okay, if you've stayed this far, I thought this would be a short video and we're at 25 minutes. But anyway, if you stayed this far, thank you for your time. I'm Bruce from Oregon, Bruce the Moose, hanging out, the Bruce from Oregon Show, Management Fundamentals. Thanks, guys. I hope this was interesting, and we'll have another management video next Tuesday. Talk to y'all later. Have a good one.